You know, there's this huge category of food that has quietly, almost invisibly, come to dominate our diets. It's hiding in plain sight on pretty much every supermarket shelf and in our kitchen cupboards, and you might not even realize what you're looking at. And when I say dominate, I am not kidding. In countries like the UK and the US, more than half of all the food we buy falls into this one single category. That is a massive, massive shift in the way we eat. So that leads to the big question, right? What exactly are these foods, and how on earth did they get everywhere? The answer? Well, it isn't as simple as you might think, and it could totally change how you look at your next grocery run.
Okay, so the culprit has a name: ultra-processed foods, or UPFs for short. But to really get what they are, we've got to separate them from their less extreme cousins, the foods that are just processed.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Forget cooking, think chemistry. The official definition of UPFs is industrial formulations. They're made with ingredients you would never, ever find in your kitchen at home. We're talking emulsifiers, flavor enhancers, modified starches, all designed for two things: an incredibly long shelf life and to be hyperpalatable. And that's just a scientific way of saying they're engineered to be almost addictively tasty.
So, to make sense of all this, scientists came up with something called the NOVA classification system. It's actually a pretty simple scale, from 1 to 4. As you can see, Group 1 is just whole foods, like an apple. Groups 2 and 3 involve some basic processing, like turning milk into cheese. But it's that last one, Group 4, that we're really focused on, the ultra-processed industrial formulas.
Okay, so this is the key takeaway here: the difference between Group 3 and Group 4. So, canned tuna in brine, that's processed. But a pre-packaged tuna salad ready meal with a laundry list of additives, that's ultra-processed. See the difference? One is a recognizable food that's been tweaked. The other is an industrial product built from the ground up.
Now, it's important to say that the science here is still evolving. There's a real debate going on among researchers. Is the problem the processing itself, the industrial methods, or is it just that these foods happen to be packed with fat, salt, and sugar? These are really active areas of research, but what's interesting is that the general advice often ends up in the same place. Eat less of the stuff that's high in fat, salt, and sugar, which, surprise, covers a lot of the UPF category anyway.
So we know what they are, but the impact of these foods goes way beyond the kitchen. The rise of UPFs is also a story about social inequality. And it turns out, this whole thing doesn't affect everyone equally.
When you dig into the research, it shows that the biggest consumers of UPFs are often the most vulnerable communities. Lower-income households and young people consistently show the highest intake. And in the US, studies have found that non-Hispanic white and Black adolescents are at the top of that list.
And here's where it gets really complicated. You might think, oh, well, it's just about affordability, right? They're cheaper. But the data shows these patterns hold true even when you take income out of the equation. That tells us there are much deeper forces at play here: culture, marketing, and the entire food environment we're all living in. And you might think the problem is just a lack of awareness, but that's not the whole story either. Get this. In the UK, a whopping 84% of people have actually heard of ultra-processed foods. But knowing the term isn't translating into action. So why the disconnect? Well, the reasons are probably going to sound pretty familiar. For starters, 65% of people say UPFs are just too hard to avoid. I mean, they're everywhere. More than half admit they're not even sure what counts as a UPF. And maybe most critically, 60% are completely unaware of the potential long-term health risks. There's this huge gap between hearing the buzzword and actually understanding what it means for your health. But this isn't a story of inevitable decline. Not at all. Let's pivot and look at a story of resistance and see how some cultures are successfully pushing back against this UPF takeover. I mean, this slide really says it all, doesn't it? While diets in the UK and the US are over 50% UPFs, countries like France and Portugal have managed to keep that number way, way lower. So what's their secret? Well, part of it comes down to something fascinating called the French paradox. For decades, scientists were scratching their heads, wondering why the French had such low rates of heart disease, even though their diet is rich in things like cheese and butter. And it turns out the answer isn't just about red wine. It's about their entire food culture. So how are they doing it?
It's this really powerful combination of culture and policy. Culturally, there's this deep national pride in home cooking, and social traditions like long family meals just naturally crowd out convenience foods. And that's all backed up by proactive government policies like clear food labels and ad bans. It creates a society that's just fundamentally more skeptical of industrial food.
Okay, so what can we learn from all this? How can we actually apply these lessons to our own lives? Let's turn all this information into a practical action plan.
The action plan really boils down to 5 key steps you can see right here. It all starts with awareness, actually reading the labels and trying to cook a bit more at home. Then it's about action, targeting the biggest culprits like snacks and ready meals, and educating the next generation. And finally, it's about advocating for bigger system-wide change.
I want to leave you with this one last thought. It's a really powerful quote from Professor Carlos Monteiro, the very person who created the NOVA system we've been talking about. He says, "The honest answer is we don't know what is going on." And that's such a humble and frankly kind of scary admission. Despite everything we've learned, the long-term effects of this massive dietary experiment we're all a part of are still unfolding. It just underscores how urgent it is that we start reclaiming our plates and questioning what's really in the food we eat every single day.